When an empath breaks, you won't hear a sound. There is no shattered glass, no screaming match, and no dramatic exit that warns the world something is wrong. Instead, it is a silent, internal erosion that happens deep beneath a perfectly composed surface. For years, the empath operates like an emotional sponge, walking into rooms and soaking up the tension, the unspoken grief, and the hidden anxieties of everyone around them. They possess a natural, almost involuntary, ability to translate pain that isn't theirs and carry burdens they never signed up for. To the outside observer, this looks like incredible resilience. They are praised for being the rock in the family or the calm one in a crisis. But what looks like strength is actually a dangerous accumulation of self-sacrifice. This invisible weight stays manageable only because the empath is biologically and psychologically wired to forgive, to rationalize, and to understand. When someone treats them poorly, the empath doesn't lead with anger, they lead with curiosity. They ask themselves what trauma made that person act out, and in doing so, they talk themselves into staying in toxic environments far longer than they should. They convince themselves that their ability to sit with discomfort without flinching is a superpower. But every time they choose someone else's peace over their own, they're taking out a high-interest emotional loan. They're piling up a debt of ignored boundaries, and eventually, that debt always comes due. The true shift begins when the pattern finally becomes undeniable, moving from a subtle feeling of fatigue to a glaring reality of exploitation. It happens on a Tuesday morning or a quiet Friday night when they realize that their generosity has simply become a baseline expectation for those around them. They give, and instead of gratitude, they receive a demand for more. They understand, and instead of being met halfway, they are met with further exploitation. The emotional bandwidth they once thought was infinite starts to narrow down to a thin, frayed wire. The conversations that used to feel like deep connections now feel like heavy, one-sided chores. Every interaction starts to feel transactional, a cycle of being drained without ever being refilled. In this final phase of the break, the empath experiences a terrifyingly new sensation. For their entire lives, they have been experts at feeling the world. But now, the signal has flipped. They stop feeling the room, and for the first time, they start feeling the crushing weight of their own existence. The composed version of them is still showing up to work, still nodding in conversation, and still performing the role of the listener. But internally, the lights have gone out. They are no longer a bridge between people. They are a fortress under siege. This is the moment they realize that being deeply understanding didn't protect them from being harmed. It actually gave people a roadmap on how to do it. The break is complete not when they lose their empathy, but when they lose the desire to use it on a world that hasn't earned it. When an empath reaches the state of overload, something fascinating and dangerous happens within their psychology. They transition from being an open book to becoming a locked vault. This is the moment where raw sensitivity evolves into tactical suppression. It is important to understand that the empath hasn't suddenly stopped feeling. They haven't turned into a robot or lost their ability to care. Instead, they have learned to contain their emotions because the external world has become too loud and too heavy to process in real time. This is a survival mechanism. Rather than expressing their hurt or shouting about their frustrations, they begin to analyze them with surgical precision. They take a giant step back from the front lines of their own lives. They become observers of their own pain, watching it from a distance rather than living inside of it. This detached state might look like maturity or getting over it to an outsider, but in reality, it is a state of extreme internal containment. This phase is not healing, it is compression. To visualize this, you have to think of the empath's mind as a high-pressure cooker. In the past, they would let off steam through small conversations, minor adjustments, or by simply shaking off the bad energy of others. But now, the valve is shut tight. Every single time they choose to stay silent instead of starting a confrontation, every time they minimize their own needs to keep the peace, and every moment they swallow a valid criticism of someone else's behavior, they are adding more pressure to the tank. They are storing these emotions in a place where no one can see them, but that doesn't mean the emotions have vanished. They are vibrating with intensity beneath the surface, waiting for the system to reach its absolute physical and mental capacity. The empath is essentially holding their breath, waiting for the moment when they can no longer contain the volume of what they've been forced to carry. The true breaking point for an empath is never a dramatic public scene or a theatrical meltdown. It is a quiet, devastating internal shift in perspective. It all comes down to a single, sharp change in the questions they ask themselves. For years, the empath's default question was, how can I understand them better? Or, what are they going through that makes them act this way? This question was a trap because it always placed the responsibility of the relationship on the empath's shoulders. But one day, the internal dialogue changes. The question becomes, why am I tolerating this? This is the most dangerous question a toxic person can ever hear from an empath. Once that question is asked, the illusion of the happy helper is shattered forever. The empath begins to look at their relationships not through the lens of potential and hope, but through the lens of cold, hard evidence. They see the imbalance, the way they have been overgiving and under-receiving. And once that truth is seen, it is impossible to unsee. This realization triggers what is known as an emotional recoil. It is a powerful, involuntary pulling back of their energy. The very same depth and intensity that allowed the empath to love someone with every fiber of their being is now redirected toward detaching from them. It is a total withdrawal. If they could love you at a level 10, they can now ignore you at a level 10. For those who used to benefit from the empath's warmth, this sudden shift feels cold, calculating, or even malicious. People will accuse the empath of being mean or acting different. But the empath isn't being mean. They are being honest for the first time in their lives. They are no longer willing to set themselves on fire to keep everyone else warm. This withdrawal is a desperate, necessary act of adaptation. They are pulling their energy back into themselves because they have finally realized that if they don't protect their own soul, no one else will. It is the ultimate act of survival. Once the internal breaking point is reached, the empath undergoes a transformation that is as quiet as it is deadly to the status quo. They don't hold a press conference, they don't send a long-winded breakup text, and they don't sit you down for a talk about how they've changed. They simply stop explaining themselves. For an empath, explaining used to be their primary language. They would spend hours over-articulating their feelings, clarifying their intentions, and softening their words, just to make sure no one felt attacked or confused. They were the ultimate bridge builders, constantly trying to fix misunderstandings before they even happened. They did this because they cared, but also because they wanted to be understood. They operated under the naive assumption that if they could just find the right words, the other person would finally get it and change. But after the break, that exhausting cycle of over-explaining comes to an abrupt and final halt. The shift happens because the empath finally wakes up to a harsh psychological truth. Not everyone misunderstands you by accident. They realize that for some people, not understanding is a calculated strategy. It's a way to keep the empath talking in circles so that the focus stays on the empath's tone or delivery rather than the other person's bad behavior. These people rely on the empath to fill every awkward silence and smooth over every conflict. But when the empath stops providing that emotional labor, the dynamic completely collapses. By choosing silence over explanation, the empath stops giving people the tools to manipulate them. They no longer provide the map to their triggers or the manual on how to pacify them. In this newfound silence, the masks that others have been wearing begin to slip. Without the empath's constant efforts to keep things comfortable, the true character of those around them is forced to come into the light. This is the moment the empath officially transitions from a participant to an observer. It is a powerful and clarifying shift in perspective. When you are a participant, you are entangled. You are reacting to every jab, every guilt trip, and every emotional demand. But as an observer, you are sitting in the front row of the theater, watching the performance without being part of the play. The empath begins to look at every interaction as raw data. They stop listening to what people say and start watching what people do when they aren't being coached or coddled. Without the empath providing the usual emotional cushioning, the other person is forced to stand on their own 2 feet, and most of the time, they stumble. The empath watches as the people who claim to love them suddenly become defensive, angry, or dismissive, simply because they are no longer being catered to. In this stage, the empath's internal dialogue becomes sharp and strategic. They start asking the questions that actually matter. Is this person's behavior consistent with their words? How do they react when I say no and don't offer a 20-minute apology for it? Who are they really when I stop making their life easy? These questions provide a level of clarity that the empath has never had before. They begin to see the subtle manipulations and the lazy patterns of those who have been draining them for years. The silence creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the truth rushes in. They notice that the people who truly care about them will step up to fill the gap with effort, while the ones who are only there for the free ride will react with resentment. The most profound part of this transformation is the empath's new relationship with tension. In the past, tension felt like a fire that the empath had to put out immediately. Now they let it burn. They realize that the awkwardness in the room or the friction in a relationship is not their problem to fix. If someone is upset because a boundary was set, the empath allows them to be upset. They don't rush in with a peace offering or a clarifying statement to lower the temperature. They understand that the tension belongs to the person who created the conflict. By refusing to carry the emotional weight for both sides, the empath forces the other person to own their own mess for the first time. This silence isn't passive. It is an active, intentional act of reclamation. It is the sound of the empath finally taking their power back. Strategic detachment is the phase that most people get wrong. When an empath begins to pull back, friends, family, and partners will often accuse them of becoming cold, heartless, or robotic. But what is actually happening is far more scientific and necessary. It is a total recalibration of the nervous system. For most of their lives, the empath has lived with their emotional skin turned inside out. They didn't just see the world, they absorbed it. Every loud argument in the next room, every micro-expression of disappointment from a boss, and every heavy vibe from a partner felt like a direct physical blow. Their nervous system was in a state of perpetual red alert, constantly scanning for threats and trying to soothe everyone else's nervous system just so they could feel safe themselves. Strategic detachment is the moment the empath finally realizes that this level of constant emotional immersion is no longer sustainable or safe. It is the act of putting their emotional skin back on and reinforcing it with iron. This shift means the empath has finally stopped internalizing the world. In the past, when someone they loved was angry, the empath became that anger. When a friend was grieving, the empath felt the literal weight of that grief in their own chest for days. Now they have developed a filter. Think of it like a high-end security system for the soul. They can still stand in the same room as a person who is venting or projecting negativity. They can still listen with high intelligence and respond with perfect politeness, but the energy no longer makes it past the front gate. They have stopped being a sponge and have started being a mirror. They see the emotion, they acknowledge the emotion, but they no longer invite it to sit down and have dinner in their mind. They are making a conscious, minute-by-minute choice about what is allowed into their internal sanctuary. Because of this filter, situations that used to trigger an immediate emergency response are now met with an eerie sense of space and stillness. In the old days, if someone gave them the silent treatment or threw a subtle guilt trip, the empath would spiral. They would lose sleep, replay the conversation 1,000 times, and rush to fix the problem just to stop the internal buzzing. Now, when that same person tries those old tactics, they hit a brick wall of calm. The empath doesn't react. They don't panic. They simply observe. This stillness is disorienting to others because the hook no longer finds a place to latch on. The empath has created a buffer zone between the external stimulus and their internal reaction. They aren't ignoring the person. They are simply refusing to be governed by the person's emotional chaos. This phase forces a completely new and healthier definition of what connection actually means. For the longest time, the empath believed that true intimacy meant total absorption, that to love someone was to lose yourself in them. They equated depth with suffering together. But through strategic detachment, they discover that real connection is actually about engaging with another person without losing your own center. It's the difference between drowning with someone and standing on the shore with a life ring. This new version of the empath is incredibly hard to influence or manipulate. Guilt trips, which used to be the empath's Achilles heel, now fall flat. Pressure tactics that used to make them buckle now only make them move further away. This is because they are no longer responding from a place of trauma-based impulse. They are responding from a place of conscious choice. Ultimately, the most important lesson of this chapter is that the empath hasn't stopped feeling. They've just stopped being a victim of their feelings. They still have their massive heart and their incredible intuition, but they have finally learned the most vital survival skill: discernment. They have realized that not every person's opinion deserves to be weighed, and not every person's emergency is their responsibility to solve. They've learned that just because they can feel someone's pain doesn't mean they must carry it. By choosing detachment, they aren't losing their humanity. They are protecting it. They are finally deciding that their peace of mind is a non-negotiable asset, and they are no longer willing to trade it away for the comfort of people who wouldn't do the same for them. In the final stage of this transformation, the empath's natural sensitivity undergoes a radical evolution, shifting from a burdensome curse into a high-definition precision tool. For most of their lives, their awareness was like a lighthouse spinning out of control, blindingly bright and scanning the horizon for anyone who might need saving. They would walk into a room and instinctively look for the person who felt left out, the partner who was simmering with quiet resentment, or the friend who was hiding a secret pain. Their focus was always outward, asking, "How can I fix this for them?" But in the stage of controlled awareness, that focus turns inward and becomes analytical. The empath is no longer scanning the room to find someone to help. They are scanning the room to see the truth of what is actually happening. They aren't looking for a mission. They are looking for patterns. They have moved from being an emotional paramedic to being an emotional detective. This is the point where the term dark empath often enters the conversation, but it is frequently misunderstood. People associate the word dark with malice or evil, but in this context, it simply refers to the absence of the light of automatic compassion. The empath has reached a level of psychological maturity where they can understand a person's pain, recognize their insecurities, and see exactly why they are acting out, without feeling the slightest urge to comfort them. This detachment is a revelation. For the first time, the empath possesses the full picture of a person's character without the interference of their own kindness clouding their judgment. Understanding is no longer a free gift that they hand out to everyone they meet. It is a premium resource that is strictly allocated based on mutual respect and consistent behavior. They have realized that their insight is valuable, and they are no longer willing to waste it on people who only use it to stay stuck in their own toxic cycles. This heightened awareness is a double-edged sword that can be used in two very different ways, depending on the situation. On one hand, it serves as an impenetrable shield for protection. Because they understand human insecurities and behavioral patterns so deeply, they can see a manipulation tactic coming from a mile away. They can spot the love bombing, the subtle guilt tripping, and the gaslighting before the other person even realizes they're doing it. On the other hand, this same awareness can be used as a lever for influence. When you truly understand what drives a person, what they fear, what they crave, and where they are weak, you gain a quiet, staggering power over the dynamic. The empath knows exactly which words will de-escalate a situation and exactly which silence will force the truth out of someone. They understand the timing of an interaction better than anyone else in the room. They know when to engage, when to withhold, and exactly when to walk away to achieve the most stable outcome for themselves. The true genius of this stage is that the empath now operates entirely within the space between a stimulus and their response. In the past, if someone insulted them, they reacted immediately with hurt or an explanation. Now they receive the stimulus, the insult, and they pause. In that pause, they analyze the person's intent. They see the insecurity that drove the insult. They evaluate the person's value in their life. And then they choose the most effective response. Sometimes that response is a sharp truth, and sometimes the most powerful response is absolutely nothing at all. This is the definition of emotional sovereignty. They are no longer a victim of their environment. They are the architect of their interactions. They have integrated their vast emotional intelligence with a cold, clear discernment, creating a version of themselves that is balanced, intentional, and most importantly, unshakable. They are no longer just people who feel deeply. They are people who see clearly and act accordingly. The final stage of this journey is marked by the death of naivety. For years, the empath operated on the beautiful but dangerous belief that everyone possessed a heart just like theirs. They lived by the rule that if they just showed enough kindness, patience, and understanding, they could heal the people around them. But through the fire of the invisible break, that illusion has been burned away. The empath is no longer a person who ignores red flags for the sake of maintaining a fake sense of harmony. They have realized that keeping the peace at the expense of their own soul is not an act of love. It is an act of self-betrayal. They finally understand that empathy without boundaries isn't a spiritual gift. It is a form of self-abandonment. By constantly making excuses for others, they were essentially teaching people how to mistreat them. That cycle is now permanently closed. In this new state of being, the empath's kindness has undergone a radical structural change. It is no longer a leaky faucet that drips for anyone who happens to be standing nearby. It is now a deliberate, controlled resource. Their heart is still as deep and capable as it ever was, but it is now protected by a sophisticated gatekeeping system. Kindness is no longer a default setting that they offer to avoid conflict. It is something that is offered where it is earned and withheld where it is exploited. They have learned the power of the word no, and they deliver it without the need for a 3-page apology. This isn't about becoming mean or jaded. It's about becoming a person of high standards. It is the realization that their energy is a precious currency, and they are the only ones with the authority to decide where it is spent. This transformation is often incredibly intimidating and even threatening to those who were used to the old version of the empath. People who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries will likely react with anger, guilt trips, or accusations that the empath has changed for the worse. But what they are actually reacting to is the loss of their unfair advantage. By setting boundaries, the empath has effectively leveled the playing field. They have removed the imbalance that allowed others to overreach while the empath overgave. When you stop being a yes man and start being a person with sovereignty, the people who were only there for the free emotional labor will naturally fall away. This is not a tragedy. It is a necessary purification of their social circle. The empath is finally seeing who is there for them and who was only there for the benefits they provided. Ultimately, the empath hasn't lost their depth or their capacity to love. In fact, their love is now more powerful because it is backed by discernment. They have integrated their soft heart with a sharp mind, creating a grounded and formidable presence. They no longer drift through life reacting to the emotional whims of others. They move through life with intention. They see the patterns of human behavior with a clarity that borders on a superpower. They know exactly how a situation will play out before it even begins, because they are no longer blinded by the hope that someone will change without doing the work. They have stepped out of the fog and into the light of absolute truth. The journey from a broken empath to a sovereign one is a path from victimhood to mastery. You have learned how to feel without drowning, how to listen without absorbing, and how to stay silent without feeling guilty. You have moved through the overload, the silence, the detachment, and the controlled awareness. You have rebuilt yourself from the ground up, and the result is a version of you that cannot be manipulated or easily shaken. Now that you have this clarity, now that you can see the chessboard of human interaction for exactly what it is, you are left with the ultimate responsibility. You are no longer the person who has to give. You are the person who chooses to give. Now that you see the patterns clearly, the only question left is, what will you do with that power?